What I'd like to do today is really take a pretty broad look at data from a variety of different viewpoints. I want to provide some initial background material, and then I'm going to look at some basic practices that can be employed to improve the quality of data management. This will be largely geared towards students and so on. And then I'm going to use 3 science examples, 2 of which will be used to identify some key principles that we can employ to help scale up a lot of our work to much broader scales, and some of the underlying data management activities that underpin that. And then the 3rd science example that I will present will be largely focused on how we implement this, and it'll get into a lot more of the education details. But I'm going to start off with a little bit of background material in the sense that I think in this room probably all recognize we are undergoing a major change in paradigms with respect to how we think about and deal with data. And this is the past view, or this is certainly the linear approach that more or less was followed as I was going through school and up until not too distant in the past. But the changing paradigm is this, the recognition that data products are a valuable result of the scientific enterprise, and these data products need to be retained, preserved, and then reused, and that's what we see via this particular animation. And it is, there are 4 major drivers, I think, for this paradigm shift that we're seeing. The first one deals with science, and throughout all of the various funding agencies and all the work that I think most of us are involved in, we recognize that the challenges we face both scientifically and societally are very difficult, and they require working across many different disciplines. So the director of the National Science Foundation, for example, is focused on what she calls convergence, or convergent science. This is really recognizing the fact that in order to address a lot of today's scientific and societal challenges, we need to work across different disciplines and scientific domains. In this case, this is a report from the National Academy that focuses on the integration of life sciences, physical sciences, engineering, and so on. And this is really will be apparent in at least a couple of the science examples that I present shortly. I use NSF, but I think, again, a lot of other agencies and a lot of our research efforts are looking, again, at some very complex issues. The graphic on the right illustrates the 10 big ideas that NSF has decided to focus on over the next several years, or possibly a couple of decades. And you can see, again, in the lower left, growing convergent research at NSF, but then all the other research ideas at the top are ones that clearly cannot be addressed by working in a single discipline. You know, you have to work across different domains in order to address a lot of these issues. Work in the Arctic and Antarctic, for example, requires a whole broad array of different sciences and engineering. The second driver, I think, is what we're seeing through societies and publishers. One of the first examples that I was aware of and actually participated in was a 2011 meeting of a whole array of professional societies and publishers that focused on developing a joint data archiving policy. And this started out with maybe 15 ecological, environmental, biodiversity, biological sciences and societies that got together and said, you know, we really need to make sure that the data are retained and support the publications that come out of our particular societies or journals. And since that initial 2011 declaration, I think about 300 journals and societies have signed on to this joint data archiving policy. Other larger commercial and other journals, PLOS and Nature, Science, have also essentially signed on to the same argument that, when we publish a paper, the data products need to also be made available and interpretable as well. The third, and clearly a big driver for those of us that receive research funding from virtually any agency now or private foundation, is the recognition that all of these sponsors require that the data be made available. Sometimes with maybe a short embargo, but the bottom line is that unless it's personally identifiable information, it really should be open and accessible within a very reasonable time frame after the data have been collected or after the articles have been published. And again, this goes international, so I show both NSF in the US, NIH has similar requirements, and then all the various private foundations that I'm aware of, including Wellcome Trust in UK, have similar requirements. And then something that really, I put this slide together before this past week's release of the newest climate assessment, but I think this also points to recognition that decision makers, the public, and others want to see that there are data underlying various statements that are made in the scientific literature and so on. And essentially, evidence-driven decision making is where we are heading very rapidly. This was the previous National Climate Impact Assessment, and this was, again, at the time it was recognized that the scientists that were involved in this needed to also provide access to the data. And this was sort of done after the fact. All of the scripts and initial scripts and so on were retained from the analytical work, but there was many dozens of person years that went into providing the links from the text in the impact assessment back to the data and the algorithms that were used. So this was not automated, and again, there was a massive team that was put together to, again, provide this direct linkage between the science and the underlying data associated with the graphics and the other analyses that were performed. So that leads me to something that I'll touch upon periodically throughout the remainder of the talk, and that is the research data lifecycle. And I show three here. The one up on the upper left, even though I'm a librarian, it's a little bit difficult for me to figure it out. It's quite complex. And I know all the people that developed it originally and so on. And then the second one comes from American Geophysical Union, and it mixes a little bit of the research lifecycle with the data lifecycle. And then the one on the right is one that I and my colleagues with DataONE created many years ago, and this was designed to help us organize educational materials, best practices, and then pointers to various software, tools, and services. And we felt that this kind of an approach, despite the arrows pointing one way, it's really not linear, and I don't think I show various alterations of this, but it is possible to, for example, in a monitoring type project, to go through a planning phase and then up through a description and preserve, and then that might be more or less where you stop for the time being. Other studies that are really synthetic or modeling in character might start with the discovery phase, where you're discovering existing data, you're doing integration across many different types of data sets, and then you perform the analysis and visualization based upon that. So again, it can be a non-linear process, but again, the point being that these are all phases that I think resonate pretty well with most people as they think about their various steps in their research activities. And I think you can read all those, so I won't go through those. The other thing, again, the point for pulling this together initially was to really think about what are some of the best practices for managing data throughout the life cycle, and what are some of the best tools that are out there. And this just shows a real tiny subset of some of the tools and services that are available. Most of them focus on open source tools. You know, for a lot of the work that we do nowadays, R and some of the various services and tools associated with it are really quite effective. And I know 20 years ago, if I were to ask this room how many people were proficient in R, you know, guess about how many hands would go up, maybe 2 or 3 out of a room this size. And I'm not going to ask it today because I don't want to be proven wrong, but I would guess that if I asked today, it would probably be about half of you have some proficiency with R in the audience. So again, this shows the entire life cycle. I'm not going to go through each of these, but I will point to, I'll be coming back to this using some of the science examples to point to some of the various tools that I think are important and that you should be aware of. And these, again, many of the principles that I'll be focused on all relate back to this research data life cycle. So again, I wanted to relate things back to some real science here. So I chose 3 examples. I'm going to start off with 2, but all of the magazine covers here really demonstrate the significant challenges that we're experiencing and having to deal with these days from both a scientific and societal standpoint. The 2 that I wanted to start off with deal with Ebola. That's the one in the upper right circle. And then challenges to Earth's biodiversity is in the illustrated by the National Geographic cover in the center. I started about initially thinking that, you know, there are probably some very different messages I could draw from each one, but the more I looked at the 2 efforts, a lot of the principles that came out of both of these scientific activities were very, very similar. So I'm going to focus on some of the biodiversity examples, but again, I think they apply very equally to health issues as well. And if I'm wrong, I'm sure I'll get some comments during the Q&A session. So this is, the reason I do focus on the Ebola is this is a new effort that I've been involved in just the last couple of years through the International Science Council and CODATA. And there's a big interest internationally in terms of figuring out ways to deal with some of these challenging data issues that work across different domains. And then how do we make data much more interoperable? How do we take some of the existing data that have been collected and then reuse that to make mitigation strategies much more efficient, monitoring much more efficient, and so on as well. So with Ebola and other vector-borne diseases, the point of this graphic is to show that really understanding these vector-borne diseases and developing mitigation approaches, again, requires working across many different scientific disciplines and domains. So you can see on the right here, we have biology of the agents involved, population genetics, water supply, sanitary engineering, travel and transport, a whole array of things that really relate to the spread of these different vector-borne diseases. So it is non-trivial. And then you get into the treatment phase. You know, how do you efficiently treat some of these diseases or try and staunch something like Ebola from spreading further? Then it gets into a lot of the human dimension and medical dimension as well. So that said, we have been able, and these are some of my colleagues that have been working on this, we have been able to look at the spread of diseases like this and then predict risk factors for spread to other areas of a particular region. So this work was, again, done with respect to the Ebola epidemic that hit Western Africa. And there was a lot of a lot of the existing information made it possible to then go back and really model it in depth, largely looking at things like travel time and distances from one area to another. So a lot of this is more or less geographically driven. And we can certainly do that with the existing data. But we start looking at some of the treatment strategies or how to deal with a major outbreak. And then the whole swath of different agencies, organizations, countries get involved, particularly with something like Ebola that is affecting numerous countries in a region of the world. So this just shows really a tiny fraction of the various agencies and organizations that were involved in responding to the West African Ebola outbreak. It was great that all of these organizations stepped up to the plate and brought all their forces to bear, but what happened afterwards? This is what we see. All the data that were collected and associated with understanding and treating the outbreak, they all went back to those individual respective organizations. And we now have immense difficulties in accessing the data or even discovering it. And then secondly, because all these different agencies had their own various idiosyncratic approaches for managing the data were all captured in different forms, column headings were different, databases were different, some were in proprietary formats, others were in Excel spreadsheets, others were, a whole array of different, almost every imaginable solution that could be employed, was employed by these different agencies. And for some reason I'm on Auto Excel here. But this points to some of the challenges, again, that we discovered through this activity through CODATA and the International Science Council. And this is a 10-year project to really work on ways to streamline this so that the next Ebola outbreaks are much easier to understand and then also to mitigate. So here were some of the initial findings from essentially doing data inventory, data audit for all the various data sources that contributed to that initial understanding and treatment of that Ebola outbreak. And you can see the results here, but again, all the data were largely remain isolated now in different silos. They had their own domain-specific formats, vocabularies, and ontologies, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of that in just a minute. And then again, they were all in different types of formats, as you see here. So again, I'm going to save some of the principles learned from this until I conclude this second example, because I think they are very closely related. But this is looking at, quote, the fragile earth, biodiversity, and this shows from GBIF, and this is probably actually approaching or exceeded 1 billion species occurrence records now that are available through GBIF. This was a screenshot from a month or so ago, so I'm sure it's larger now. And you can see, again, where a lot of the biodiversity work has been done over the years, largely in the US, Europe, and then Australia, New Zealand. This particular graphic, though, shows all of the various sources of biodiversity data on the bottom here. And you may not be able to see all this, but it ranges from individual specimens, genetic material, citizen science observations as indicated by the binoculars, photographs. There's a whole array of now sources for biodiversity data. And then the uses are really quite varied. This relates to conservation needs for sure, food provision, food security, health, a whole array of uses for biodiversity information. And the challenges in the past in terms of actually getting the biodiversity information and then transforming it into a useful format for research and decision making has been, again, pretty immense challenge. So this has led to a fairly recent concept that we create what is known as essential biodiversity variables. And the approach here, and hopefully you can see it better than I can from this angle, but is essentially to collect and process some of the raw biodiversity and specimen data and then package it in a standardized format. So in the center here is a key component of the EBV framework is create a data cube that has space, time, and then the other axis is either species or ecosystem function or some other key parameters that we wish to delve more deeply into. And the whole idea is, again, to focus the community on developing these products that are much more standardized, well-formatted, and documented that can be reused for a variety of different purposes. It would be easier to integrate, let's say, data from one data cube with another data cube and then address some of these complex challenges. And then the bottom here basically leads to essentially the area on the right here, which is assessments, reports, other key decision documents. And one of the reasons for generating this format in the first place was to help identify whether or not nations in the world were meeting their biodiversity targets and other sustainability goals for the United Nations. So that's all theoretical. Over the last couple years, my colleagues at both the Global Biodiversity Informatics Facility and the Atlas of Living Australia did 3 different pilot studies looking at the feasibility of developing these data cubes that I showed previously. And they worked with three species in particular. The first one is an acacia. It's a tree that is native to some parts of Australia, but it's become invasive in other parts of Australia. The wasp is a European wasp that is truly an invasive species in Australia. And then the third is an ibis species that is also invasive, but the potential impact is relatively unknown on ecological processes and function in the ecosystems there. So there were a number of challenges in association with this, and the first goal was to really take the data that were available through GBIF, and then also take the data that were available through the Atlas of Living Australia, recognizing that they each were tapping into different museum collections and sources for the data. So there would be clearly, the first couple of challenges I show here were anticipated. There would be some underlap in coverage from, let's say, ALA to GBIF, and then in some cases they would be tapping the same sources, so there would be duplication of records. So in order to, again, to create a nice clean data set, you had to be able to deal with both of these issues. In particular, the deduplication of records is somewhat non-trivial. Export mechanisms differed between the two packages. So again, when you want to pull data out of GBIF, it's a very different approach than pulling it out of Atlas of Living Australia. And even very simple things that you would think that had been agreed upon, column headings and so on, were all entirely different between the two different systems. Second, another key challenge was the fact that there were no mechanism for logging the processes. So when you perform various activities through one of these cyber infrastructure organizations, there was no real way to track what you had done. So it was all essentially a manual process. And then lastly, there was no single tool that was effective for manipulating the data, and that was one of the reasons for having to export all the data and then manually, more or less manually integrate data from the two different infrastructures. And then Lee Belbin, who, a friend and colleague of mine, he had, I think, something that is probably common to a lot of any efforts that we in the audience have participated in where we're trying to integrate data. We initially think it's an easy thing to do, but then if you read his comment there, it's like many more steps were required than even the most pessimistic player could envisage. And I think this is something that we've all experienced. So this led both the initial formulation of EBVs as a data product or a new framework for collecting and managing biodiversity data and related types of data. And then the challenges that emerged from these 3 pilot studies that I just showed led to a group getting together in Bari, Italy to develop a framework for to establish principles that would make it easier to essentially create these essential biodiversity variables. And again, I think the principles that came out of this apply equally to virtually any other effort, including the Ebola example that I showed earlier as well. So I'm going to step through these principles, and I'm going to dive a little bit more deeply into the first one here because I think it's really quite relevant today. And this is the first one that, and again, you can sort of take out where it says EBVs, but just apply it to virtually any study. But in this case, it's important to have a comprehensive data management plan. And then I'll point this to a paper that I published in PLOS Computational Biology in 2015. It's in the 10 Simple Rules series, and those of you that know Phil Bourne, formerly with NIH, he created this series in PLOS Computational Biology. It's called 10 Simple Rules, and it's 10 simple rules for just about anything we do as scientists. So if you want to, I would hope that at some point he's going to compile all of these, but if you want to identify the 10 simple rules for writing a research paper, or 10 simple rules for creating a really effective poster presentation, or there are now probably 60 or 70 of these 10 simple rules papers in the series, and it's a great place to find, again, useful guidelines for doing just about anything we do as scientists or researchers. So this one is one that I am going to delve a little bit more deeply into, and you can see the research life cycle at the very top. This is maybe somewhat abbreviated, but I think it should resonate with folks fairly well. And then the data life cycle is just a slight variation of the DataONE life cycle that I showed previously, but it's got a lot of the same components. So again, I have 10 principles I'm going to show, but now I'm going to shift gears a little bit and go into creating a data management plan. I'm going to provide these 10 simple rules, and then we'll get back to the principles after I do that. So hopefully this makes sense. So the first one is to determine research sponsor requirements. And this is very important. One of the reasons I say this is it may not be so obvious when you actually go and look at NSF, for example, and try and figure out what the sponsor requires, because you have to delve a little bit deeply there, more deeply, in the sense that NSF as a single agency has the unusual perspective that every different directorate and many different programs are so unique that they each require their own separate format for data management plans. So you have to identify which one is relevant to the particular program that you're applying to. But virtually every agency now has requirements for data management plans, and some of these are spelled out. In some cases, it's beneficial to actually talk to a program officer and determine what the specific requirements are. Secondly, identify the data to be collected, the types, sources, volume, formats, and so on. And things that are really critical in this case, I think, are volume and then type. And a lot of people overlook this. If it becomes evident to a reviewer that you are collecting a massive amount of data, let's say a terabyte of data, and you plan to analyze it via an Excel spreadsheet, then you're probably a little bit naive with respect to the research you're about to do. Also, format is important if you're working with geospatial data. Again, that's something that you would not ever want to tackle in a spreadsheet format, probably, but you would probably want to use a geographic information system or some other more appropriate tool. And then similarly with something that requires a lot of transactional work, a database management system might be much more appropriate. The third rule, define how the data will be organized. Some of this is apparent from my comments with respect to the last rule. And then fourth, explain how the data will be documented. And this is, again, not necessarily as trivial as we all might like. In many cases, it's useful to contact researchers in the field, talk to a research data librarian, for example, to help identify the particular metadata format that you should be using, and then also identifying particular tools. There are a lot of metadata formats out there. Some of them don't necessarily have user-friendly tools associated with them that allow you to create and manage the metadata at least as easily as we would all like. The fifth is to describe how the data quality will be assured. And interestingly, at least from my perspective, this is something where we've sort of gotten off the right road over the last couple of decades or so. I know when I went through school, which I know was in the dark ages, but we were all required to take statistics. And as part of that, there was usually a section on terms of how to manage data. So quality assurance, quality control was really, impressed upon me from the very beginning. But now I see lots and lots of students and even researchers that don't really think about the data quality side of it until they end up with some results that are really quite apparently erroneous in some way, shape, or form. And then they go back and try and figure out, well, what's wrong with the data, because the data aren't supporting what I think they should support. Clearly not the most appropriate way to be doing our research. But this gets into things like, the data entry side of it. In some cases it brings in some engineers to the table in terms of making sure that we're actually automating the capture of that data correctly from in the field sensors and otherwise. And then how we deal with manual data entry. And then there are a plethora of really nice and usable tools out there that we can use for QA/QC. Again, many of them available through R and packages that have been developed in the R language, so a lot of these are free and open, so I would encourage you to check those out. Rule number 6, present a sound data storage and preservation strategy. And there are a number of questions to ask here. How long should the data be available? I know John Faults, a database specialist at the University of Virginia, asked me at a meeting about 35 years ago. I remember him saying, one of the challenges that all of you environmental scientists face is you don't know when to throw away data. You just assume that you're going to keep all of these data forever. And in reality, it's not feasible, probably nor desirable to do so. We continue to bleed lots and lots of data simply because we have no way to really capture and maintain those data for the long term. But in those cases where we do have valuable data sets and we can say it would be nice to retain these for 10, 20 years, then we need a place to do that. And there is a site, re3data.org. It's the registry of research data repositories. Any of you that are interested in identifying particular data that might meet your needs, this is a great site to go to. It's also a great place to go to determine where the repositories are that you might want to deposit your data after you've, or during or after you've completed your research project. The next phase is to define the project's data policies, and clearly I and agencies encourage more openness in this regard. So something like Creative Commons CC0 or CC BY license is highly recommended. And then Rule 8, describe how the data will be disseminated. Will it be simply available through maybe a data repository for those that are lucky enough to discover it, or will you take the next step in terms of trying to publish the data as, quote, a data paper, which you can more easily do now through a number of sources as I show here. And then the last couple rules are, one, assign roles and responsibilities, identify those people in your lab and others that will be taking on different components of this, and then prepare a realistic budget so that those reviewers will be able to see that, yes, they plan to do this particular data management activity and there are real dollars to support it, be it hardware, software, personnel time, or otherwise. And it's a great tool that will help step you through this. It's the dmptool.org. Those of you that are not familiar with it, check it out. It's free, easy to use. Now, this gets back to the principles again. And I'm going to go through these probably just fairly quickly. So again, with respect to the work for the essential biodiversity variables anyway, and again, I think it applies more broadly, is to identify a common framework of dimensions and conform with established representations for data formats and so on. And this is where a lot of communities have focused significant effort in terms of identifying preferred standards. And again, instead of creating your own, adding yet another standard to the thousands of standards that already exist, choose something that has already been widely adopted within your particular community. Third, products should have human and machine readable metadata, again, compliant with community standards. And some of the community standards I show here are out there, and in many cases there are some reasonably user-friendly tools that will help you comply with these different metadata content standards. The fourth is all products should include information that helps assure the quality of the data. And I show some examples here, again, from some fairly simple approaches. Scatter plots on the left are really a great way to get a sense in terms of the data distributions, help determine whether your data are normal or need some kind of a transformation. And then an important one here that a lot of experimental or people working with long records of in situ sensor collected data, for example, use are these quality control charts. And all of these are, well, the one on the left and the one on the right and many other QA/QC visualizations are easily done in R, and there are a number of textbooks that will help step you through that. And in the center, I show one that I've not been able to figure out how to do in R yet, but there probably is a package there. But this is a quality control chart generated through JMP, which is often available at many universities at a very reasonable discount. The fifth, and I won't go into detail here, but this is more for the programmers in the audience, is to use standardized application programming interfaces or APIs. And again, the idea is to just make it easier to integrate across different organizations by following or using common APIs. So I will take a little bit of departure here and look at DataONE for just a minute, a project that I'm involved in. And this is how we do that. We have a common API that we provide to the different data repositories that we're working with. We have about 40 some data repositories that are all part of this federation. And the idea was to create a single portal where a researcher could identify the environmental data that they were interested in working with, again, very easily through a common single interface. And this is what it looks like. Basically, go to DataONE. There are lots of ways to get to this particular screen. And you can see a variety of different data sets on the left. This is looking at the entire set of data. Right now, just looking at one area of the world, but we have global coverage. And you can see virtually every cell's got many data sets associated with it. And the different logos over there on the left are the different repositories that hold those data. And then we can look, it's via faceted search. And again, this is all enabled by having that common underlying API. And we can go and look, let's say, for data within a specific set of years or particular locations, or maybe a specific taxon, or other ways to really drill down and identify this very specific data that we might be looking for. The sixth is to use standard workflows and then have these fully documented and published. And this was the challenge that Lee Bellman ran into with trying to pull data out from the Atlas of Living Australia and GBIF, and that there was no real way to automate that process or track it. So some solutions that are out there, and there are more than probably a couple dozen really good workflow packages out there in different areas. Some really good ones in the bioinformatics arena that some of you are probably familiar with. Two that I'm most familiar with are Kepler, which was developed out of Berkeley initially, and then secondly, Taverna, which was developed in the UK but has now been adopted by the Apache organization. So these are all workflows that, again, can be used to capture all the different steps in everything from data acquisition through manipulation, massaging the data, to creating particular analyses or visualizations. And all of these are captured in these workflows, and then it makes it possible to either rerun those workflows, or what's often done is to take these workflows and modify them, maybe add in extra data or revise the data that are contributing to it, or add some new visualization to the workflow as well, and then publish that new workflow as a separate entity with its own individual identifier. The package, the site in the center is called My Experiment, and this is a location where a lot of these different workflows can be published. So this is, again, a great site if you want to see if anyone has done a particular complex analysis, and if so, you can look at their workflows and then potentially rerun those, connect up with the individual researcher, and so on. So the seventh is provenance information should be readable both by humans and machines. This is a real challenge. Currently, there are not a lot of provenance tools out there. There's a lot of work that is highlighted through the site on the left that I highlight, openprovenance.org. And then also in DataONE.org, our group, we have started working on this, and we now provide some tools that support generation of provenance information for two particular packages. One is MATLAB, and then the other is R. So it is possible to generate provenance information for those two packages in our environment. And then the other relates to ontologies, and again, I won't get into great detail here, but this is the way to help make sure that we are being very precise with our definitions and relationships across concepts. Obo Foundry is a great site to look for these. And then lastly, I show ENVO, the environment ontology, is one that we use pretty extensively in the environmental sciences. Again, data should be preserved in a community repository. I mentioned re3data.org earlier, but there's a nice way to search through and identify particular repositories that might meet your needs. And then lastly, data should be timely, open, and fair. And fair is a common buzzword these days. It stands for findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. And there's a great site that will help you identify tools and services to help make your data fair. And this is the fair.sharing.org site, and there's information there, for example, to find metadata, editors, and so on that will help you out with different steps along the way. So the third example I'm going to conclude with is looking at our filthy seas here. And this was started from an effort by Ben Halpern and others at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis, looking at trying to understand the health of our oceans and what leads to that current state. So this was an effort in 2008 that was published in Science, and clearly, as we would expect, a lot of the health of our oceans and coastal areas are related to traffic of shipping and so on, bringing invasive species, exotic species to different ports and so on. This effort led to the recognition that this would be a great thing to understand, but to repeat on a yearly basis to see if we are making any efforts or progress with respect to improving the health of our oceans. So this led to something called the Ocean Health Index. And this started up in 2012, and it continues through present. And basically, if you go to the website, and if you just look up Ocean Health Index, you'll be able to find it very easily. It covers roughly 250 areas of the ocean, economic zone, coastal economic zones, and then open bodies of water on the planet. And you can go to any one of these individual areas and look at the health of that particular area for maybe 10 or 12 different themes here. So things like ability to support fisheries and a whole array of others that are all part of this Ocean Health Index. All data that are publicly available and collected and updated on a frequent basis. So one of the values in going to this site, though, is looking at some of the work that they did. So in order to replicate this from one year to the next, they developed a toolbox to help support this. And then a lot of their work was published in this paper here in Nature, Ecology, and Evolution. This is Julie Lowndes and colleagues from the Ocean Health Index project. This paper is, again, directly available through the website. And it shows what they did. So they developed their framework, the scientific framework. That led to a specific toolbox that was used to, again, generate this Ocean Health Index for all of these 250 plus or minus areas on an annual basis. And the important thing I wanted to illustrate here is in the right, which is this is the ease of collaboration with respect to creating this annual Ocean Health Index. And then the ease of reproducibility is on the left axis. And the point being that they started out in 2012 with a great deal of science, a huge amount of effort that went into creating that framework and developing that initial toolbox. And then in 2013, year two, it took a lot less effort to actually reproduce the calculation of these ocean health indices. And then they were able to progressively spend less and less time on the informatics side of it and more time on the research side of it, but with an overall reduction in effort over the course of time. Hopefully this makes sense. So you can go to the Ocean Health Index and dive a little bit more deeply into it. They provide all of the tools and so on. But again, a key point is here's some of the resources that were used, and then they have an introduction to open data science that is very easy to go through to provide, training in terms of how to replicate this sort of work. It's a great source for learning about, again, some of the key tools and approaches. And you may or may not be able to see it. I can't read it from here myself, but I think in the middle portion on the left side is a key statement about one of their approaches was, in terms of doing this, was to form a small community. So this working group through NCs formed a small community and essentially helped work themselves through all of the various tools and approaches for creating these ocean health indices using open science tools. So they all sort of got in the same room and they learned R and R open science and a number of the tools together as a group. So I want to conclude, I think, with this slide, or maybe the next one, with some other sources of information. ESIP, the Earth Science Information Partnership, provides now a clearinghouse for information on a whole variety of different informatics topics. So if you want to get training in any particular area, it's a great source. In the upper right shows DataONE.org. We have 10 modules that cover all the different aspects of the data lifecycle, so we have lots of education resources there. Our studio provides lots of online learning for different aspects of the R programming language and associated tools. And then something that you may want to consider here, we've just are doing this through the University Library at New Mexico now, but we are entering into a partnership with the software carpentries to run data carpentry, software carpentry, and library carpentry on a frequent basis at our university and then as well as around the state. Recognizing that we need more people that are much better trained in programming skills, data management skills, and so on. And in a lot of cases, I would argue, they are not getting that through traditional computer science programs. And I think I'll stop here and can take questions as time allows. Thank you.
You always need someone to get us started. So you lay out a clear set of activities that could go on to improve our data management. How do you see the split between the institutional responsibilities around those processes and the individual research activities or researchers' responsibilities? Because some of these say, oh, you need a repository, and put it here and do that, and individual researchers don't have that. So do you have a position on sort of how to find that balance or what that looks like across the fields?
You've hit the nail on the head there. That's a really tough nut to crack in the sense that, I look at agencies, for example, funding agencies, and they have these mandates, as I showed, with respect to making data available, and they point their finger to individual scientists and institutions for meeting those. Then when I talk to the institutions, they point to either the individual researchers or the funding agencies as being responsible for various pieces and parts. So again, there's no real clear consensus, but what I think is really reasonable is, within an institution to, look and see where you're going to get the greatest efficiency, the greatest big bang for the buck, so to speak. And I would argue that what a lot of universities, not a lot, some universities are starting to do is provide research data services. And I know we do this at UNM. I think Purdue does this as well. And that is to provide research librarians, essentially data librarians, out to different colleges. And they serve on the front line in terms of working with faculty and students, pointing them to how to get their data into some kind of an institutional repository, be it their university or a non-university repository, how to create data management plans using DMP tool. You know, there's a lot of things that can be done through a centralized service like that. That said, it's also incumbent upon individual scientists to know their responsibilities with respect to the data production side of it as well. So the thing that I find really quite shocking is the extent to which most sponsored research offices are not cognizant of the compliance issues that they are facing. I was recently on a panel with a lawyer from the Office of the Inspector General at the National Science Foundation who was on his way to, quote, potentially shut down a university's research program because they were not providing access to the data that were collected. So, you know, if you have NSF funding and H funding others, you know, you are really supposed to provide the data. The university is responsible for that. And that means that a student, for example, that collects data off of a sponsored grant, if they don't leave the data and make it available when they leave, then the university faces a serious compliance issue. So again, there's not been a whole lot of examples made, but I guarantee you sometime within the next couple of years, NIH, NSF, other private foundations are going to step in and they're going to start making examples. So it's probably beneficial for all of us in the room, particularly librarians, sponsored program offices and so on, to really think through this and ascertain, you know, which organizations within our university are best poised to help researchers with this particular aspect of the data management lifecycle. So as we're waiting for another, oh, I have a question back.
Would that be available through the committee that organizes Keynote?
We could do that.
I'm sorry?
This is also being recorded, and so once we have the
presentation
caption set
yes.
up, it'll be available online.
There was just a lot of information on the slides that you weren't able to.
Yes. Yeah, I'm happy to provide that. So. And I did try and include as many of the links to various other resources and so on, so please check those out. And if you identify others that I might have overlooked, I'm always welcome for feedback as well. So as we're waiting, I don't know if there's any other questions, but again, to get back to yours, one of the things I think we can all play a role in, and that is in education, either self-education through some of the sources that I showed there, or, you know, establishing carpentry classes and a cadre of trainers at our various universities, instilling new courses. I know a number of universities I've visited lately, they have short seminars or workshops available through the university library, which oftentimes is chosen because it's a centralized location, it's objective, it's easy for people to find it, and then there might be short workshops on, you know, how to create a data management plan or how to use R for this particular purpose and so on. If not.
So you've been talking about a lot of cross-institutional projects with managing and making research data available. What kind of, I guess, like legalese needed to exist behind the scenes, like so that there was understanding, you know, of people's time in various institutions, but also so that, you know, for the longevity of various projects, that, you know, somebody's not going to pull out at the last minute, and so that there's some institutional support going forward for those kinds of projects.
Right. That's again, another great question. This gets into the people factor and the. I think it's. There are two things. One is, in some cases, you do need like written documents to support this, where you're trying to get agreements, particularly cross-border activities. So again, like the Ebola was a great example there. And that was really challenging. It's still a challenge in terms of getting all of those various organizations that I showed that were working in West Africa to agree to share their data. And it's been non-trivial, and all of them have individual requirements for dealing with confidential issues and so on. So that was like maybe a worst case scenario, but there have been some agreements that have come out of that. I think it's called the Sendai framework that is helping drive a lot of this, so it's a UN framework. In other cases, when, for example, the collaboration with ALA and GBIF, this was done on the basis of personal communication. You know, the fact that Lee Belbin and his team knew the people at GBIF and they were quite willing to work with one another and had a history, in fact, of doing so. So some of those easy, quick successes are, you know, a great way to sort of open the door there. But it is a huge challenge. Paul Euler is with the National Academy as their data guy for 3 or 4 decades now. He just recently retired, but he's a consultant. But he said, you know, this is still probably the biggest challenge that we all face is like, you know, legal aspect of interoperability. So the technical issues can be solved. We know that. There's still work to be done, clearly, but the legal and social interoperability aspects are still somewhat the most challenging. And part of that can be accomplished through education. I mean, simply getting people to recognize that, you know, there really is no need to try and carry your data into your grave with you. You know, it's probably more valuable to share it and provide it as a product. The key thing is that we all want to see is that those people that are generating intellectual products get credit for it. So, and there's a lot of effort right now through DataONE and then DataCite and other organizations to provide credit for those data products. So if you generate a data product and publish it, let's say, in a repository like Dryad, there's a digital object identifier associated with that, and you can actually add that data product to your CV, just like you can the article that's associated with the data product. So that's something we should all be working towards as well, is really getting people to adopt that. I will ask one question of you all. How many of you, because this is important with respect to this particular topic, how many of you have orchids? So, okay, if you don't know what it is, you probably don't have it. So ORCID is a unique identifier for you as a researcher. So if you are generating papers or products and you want them associated with you, so for example, Dale Hendrickson here, you know, if he wants to get credit for that product that he created and not have it associated with Dale Hendrickson back there because it's a common name, there's like multiple Dale Hendricksons, then, you know, he would have an ORCID ID. So this is really critical, and then, you know, go ahead and jump on the bandwagon now because a lot of agencies are going to be requiring this, universities are going to be requiring it, but it's, again, a great way to start getting credit for your intellectual output. And that's ORCID for those of you that are trying to look it up. So it's misspelled.
Well, now that you've mentioned ORCID IDs, I'll ask a question about them. So there seems to be two aspects of understanding things with research and data and things. One is who did it, right? Who deserves the credit? And then who has current rights to it? How does that play out across this, and how are those distinct, and what's happening with that, and how do you see that evolving?
So a number of the metadata management systems or metadata tools that are out there for creating metadata provide fields that are used to identify that. So you can specify who the originator was, possibly who created the metadata, and then possibly who the contact is for using the data. So one of the things I encourage is people to document data in all ways, shapes, and forms as comprehensively as possible. So, if there are steps that need to be taken to use the data, or you can provide additional information, then do that as part of the metadata. That's probably the only way in the long term to, ensure that at least there's a high probability that people will use the data appropriately, that the citation will be done appropriately for the originators and so on, and that is to include in the metadata that's associated with the data. So that's the only solution I'm aware of.
Hi, I have a question about reproducibility. So you mentioned provenance and some of the tools that are available in R and MATLAB to record the process. What is your assessment of how these developments like this, how they've been accepted by publishers, and what's the relationship between publications and the underlying processes that led to the results?
That's a tough one in the sense that there are a number of tools that are now available. Publishers have initially taken the view, by and large, that it's the data products themselves that should be available. They've not really taken that next step, and even a lot of funders have not taken that next step in assuring that the workflows, the scripts, R scripts and so on that generated particular data products are available as well. So that is a bit more of a challenge. Ultimately, it's up to two groups. One, funders at some point are going to start enforcing this. So, and I've seen this in a couple of cases where people have been funded for long projects, and they put in a renewal proposal, and then the panel will look and see whether or not the data products are available from that first set of funding, and if they're not, then they'll recommend or a decline to the funder, which they can either accept or not. And then secondly, it's up to publishers and others to, again, have as part of their peer review process the fact that people can go and look at those data products as well as the underlying scripts. So very few journal editors do that. It requires more work on their part to do so. I'm an editor for Ecological Archives, and we do require that. We generate these golden oldie ecology data sets, and we want to make sure that the data product the data itself has been reviewed as well as the metadata. And then we also require the submission of if there are any particular scripts that were necessary to transform, that those be available to reviewers as well. But until we take that next step, then a lot of the workflow tools and so on that can expedite this are not going to be fully embraced. It's all part of the training as well, in the sense that the first time you create a Kepler workflow is, it takes a little bit of work. It's like when I show with the Ocean Health Index toolbox, that group of researchers, they had to get together and sort of train themselves because they didn't have carpentry and other mechanisms for learning these tools, so they sort of did it themselves. But there are now education ways to figure out, how to create and use these workflows. Ultimately, I think it comes back to the funders as well, in the sense that they're going to have to put a lot more funding into creating more user-friendly software tools and services. You know, what I've gotten a lot of my funding out of SIZE at NSF, and I feel like I can criticize them now in the sense that, you know, it's easy to go in there with an idea and get funding to create, like, let's say, a prototype. But then if you want to take that prototype to the next level and make it really user-friendly and intuitive so that, you know, anyone can come in and reuse that tool, then that's where the funding falls short. They typically don't take that last mile, so to speak. And that's what's going to be really critical as we move forward.
So in the social sciences, especially in political science, there's a movement of some of the journals to make acceptance for publication contingent on reproduction of the results. And so you submit a manuscript and you also submit all the materials that went into your analysis. And here at Yale, we, shameless plug, but there's a group of us who have developed a workflow tool to help in that process. In that, we're calling it a curation process, really, because we're curating the data, the code that are going to become public to make sure that it really reproduces the results. So there seems to be more activity on that front, but I agree with you that the publishers have to require it, and then the funders really need to put some dollars behind it.
Yeah, we're at this big transition period now, and I would argue that, you know, we really do need to see this major transformation occur, and part of it is in, let's say, tenure and promotion practices as well. It takes more effort to do a publication and then provide the data product with good documentation and all the workflows and so on that are associated with that, so someone could reproduce, you know, that set of analyses if necessary, than it does to create, let's say, 5 publications without paying attention to the data and so on. And what we've done is we've created this beast, I think, in academia where, you know, your livelihood depends upon the number of pubs, you know, and you want to spend as many time generating 8 or 10 publications a year as opposed to 2 or 3 that are really high quality publications plus high quality data products that are associated with that. And until we start changing some of that mindset, it's going to be a little bit difficult. So funding agencies and professional societies and publishers are all going to have to, again, get on the wagon train, so to speak, and move in this direction. And personally, I would like to see fewer publications anyway, because I can't keep up with them anymore. It's like, you know, let's reduce the number.
This is just a little bit of self-promotion for Yale. Bill mentioned the ORCID unique identifier. Yale has access to that service. And if you need help with that, reach out to a research data librarian or a librarian across the system. They can help you with that. Another tool he mentioned is the data management planning tool. We also have that at Yale, and anybody can use that. And a real shortcut to get a lot of this is there's a website called researchdata, all one word, .yale.edu, and all that information is there.
Great.